You've entered void of rules, a realm where normal constraints cease to exist. But beware, traveller, there is one rule here. You've got to hit subscribe. Seriously, it's the only rule we have. We just reached 1,000 brave souls, and we're hunting for 9,000 more to complete our dark ritual. I mean, reach our next goal, so subscribe. Or don't. But remember, the void remembers those who defy the only rule. Now let's get into today's video. Chris Thompson sat in his cramped apartment office at 2:17 AM, the blue glow of his computer screen illuminating the dark circles under his eyes that had become permanent fixtures over the past 3 years. Empty coffee cups formed a defensive perimeter around his keyboard, their ceramic surfaces reflecting the monitor's light like tiny mirrors. Research papers covered every available surface: police reports, newspaper clippings, historical documents and photographs that documented humanity's most terrifying encounters with the supernatural. The apartment itself had become a monument to obsession. Every mirror had been removed or covered with black cloth, from the bathroom medicine cabinet to the decorative pieces that had once adorned the living room walls. Visitors often commented on the oppressive atmosphere, the way shadows seemed to gather in corners where reflective surfaces should have provided light. But Chris barely noticed anymore. He had more important concerns than interior decorating. For the past 6 months, he'd been chasing something that consumed his thoughts during waking hours and invaded his dreams: the connection between mirror-based supernatural phenomena and specific geographic locations. His research had revealed patterns that mainstream paranormal investigators either missed or deliberately ignored. Clusters of disappearances, suicides, and unexplained deaths that occurred near certain reflective surfaces, following cycles that spanned decades or even centuries. It had started with his younger brother Ben's death 3 years ago, though Chris now understood that the true beginning reached much further back. Ben had called him that final night, voice shaking with terror that Chris had initially attributed to another anxiety episode. His brother had been struggling with what doctors called treatment-resistant depression, a condition that seemed to worsen despite medication, therapy, and the family's desperate attempts to provide support. "The voices are getting stronger, Christopher," Ben had whispered into the phone, using the formal version of his brother's name that he reserved for moments of genuine fear. "They're not in my head anymore. They're coming from the mirrors. Every time I look at my reflection, there's someone else looking back." Chris had been in the middle of writing a blog post about alleged hauntings in New England lighthouses, barely paying attention to what he assumed was another symptom of his brother's deteriorating mental state. He'd given Ben the same advice he always did: take your medication, call Dr. Martinez in the morning, try to get some sleep. The conversation had lasted less than 5 minutes before Chris returned to his research, dismissing his brother's pleas for help as paranoid delusions. He found Ben's body the next morning. The scene was burned into Chris's memory with photographic clarity. Ben hanging in their childhood bathroom, facing the mirror above the sink, his eyes open and fixed on his own reflection. The bathroom was destroyed. The mirror shattered from the inside, glass embedded in the walls as if something had exploded outward from within the frame. Water covered the floor, though no pipes had burst. The temperature in the room was at least 20 degrees colder than the rest of the house, cold enough that Chris's breath was visible when he entered. The police ruled it suicide, noting Ben's history of mental illness and the obvious signs of self-harm. They couldn't explain the shattered mirror or the temperature anomaly, but those details were relegated to footnotes in their report. The family accepted the official explanation because accepting anything else would have required confronting possibilities too terrifying to consider. But Chris couldn't let it go. He began researching mirror-related supernatural phenomena with the same methodical approach he brought to all his investigations, treating Ben's death not as a personal tragedy to be mourned, but as a case to be solved. What he discovered changed everything he thought he knew about the paranormal. Ben's experience wasn't unique. Chris found dozens of similar cases scattered across police databases, medical examiner reports, and local newspaper archives. Young adults found dead in rooms containing mirrors, their bodies positioned as if they had been staring at their reflections when death came. The mirrors were always damaged, cracked, shattered, or bearing marks that suggested impact from within. Witnesses, when they existed, reported temperature drops, unexplained sounds, and the persistent sensation of being watched. The pattern was too consistent to be coincidental, but it was also too scattered across time and geography for conventional investigation. Chris realized he was looking at something that operated according to rules humanity didn't understand, following cycles that spanned generations. He dedicated his life to mapping these patterns, turning his paranormal investigation blog into a refuge for people who had experienced similar phenomena. Reflected Horrors became more than just another ghost story website. Chris approached each case with scientific rigor, collecting electromagnetic readings, temperature data, and photographic evidence that other investigators either couldn't or wouldn't obtain. He interviewed survivors of mirror encounters, documented their experiences with forensic detail, and began building a database that revealed the true scope of what he came to think of as reflection-based supernatural predation. The blog attracted attention from unexpected quarters. Dr. Elizabeth Warren, a psychology professor at Harvard who specialized in unusual death phenomena, began corresponding with Chris about his findings. Father Miguel Santos, a Catholic priest who performed exorcisms, shared accounts of encounters with entities that manifested through mirrors. Most importantly, families of victims reached out to him, desperate for explanations that conventional authorities couldn't provide. It was through one of these families that Chris learned about the Morrison house. The email from Helen Garrett arrived on a Tuesday evening that felt heavy with approaching rain, the kind of atmospheric pressure that seemed to make the boundary between the natural and supernatural more permeable. Unlike the usual submissions filled with blurry photographs and second-hand accounts, Helen's message contained images of a leather-bound journal, its pages covered in elegant handwriting that spoke of genuine terror survived through careful planning and iron will. "Mr. Thompson," her letter began, "I followed your work since my granddaughter showed me your blog after reading about similar experiences to her own. My grandmother, Eleanor Whitmore, survived an encounter with what she called the Mirror Woman in 1943. She was 19 years old at the time, curious about the supernatural in the way that only young people can be. She left detailed instructions in her journal, claiming they were the only reason she lived through the night. I'm 93 years old now, too frail to investigate this myself, but someone should know the truth before I pass and take these secrets with me." The photographs Helen included showed pages that had been preserved with obsessive care. Eleanor's handwriting was precise, the work of someone who understood that accuracy might mean the difference between life and death. But it was the content of her account that made Chris's hands tremble as he read. Eleanor's journal was unlike anything Chris had encountered in 3 years of intensive research, where other accounts were vague and contradictory, filled with subjective impressions and unreliable memories. Eleanor wrote with the precision of a scientist documenting a controlled experiment. She described the entity as something far older and more complex than the simple vengeful spirit of folklore. According to Eleanor, Bloody Mary wasn't a ghost at all. She was something that existed in the spaces between reflections, a consciousness that had learned to navigate the strange physics of the mirror realm. Mary fed on life force, but not in the crude way that most supernatural parasites operated. She was selective, intelligent, preferring victims whose minds contained particular qualities: creativity, intelligence, emotional depth. She was especially drawn to people who carried guilt or unresolved grief, emotions that created vulnerabilities she could exploit. The journal detailed 17 previous attempts to contact the entity at 1847 Elm Street, dating back to 1887, when the house was first built. Eleanor had spent months researching these attempts before making her own, learning from the failures of those who had come before. Of the 17 documented summoning attempts, only Eleanor had survived. But what made Eleanor's account truly extraordinary was her description of the entity's true nature and methodology. Mary wasn't randomly malevolent, striking without purpose or plan. She was strategic, capable of learning from each encounter, adapting her techniques based on the psychological profile of each victim. Eleanor theorized that Mary had been growing stronger with each successful feeding, evolving her methods, perfecting her psychological manipulations over more than a century of practice. "She studies us," Eleanor had written in one particularly chilling passage. "Each person who enters her domain provides new information about human nature, new techniques for exploitation. She's been building a library of human weakness, cataloguing our fears, our desires, our breaking points. By the time most people realize they're not just facing a supernatural entity, but a predator who has spent decades learning how to hunt our species, it's far too late to adapt their strategies." Eleanor's survival had come through careful preparation and an understanding that Mary's rules weren't arbitrary supernatural requirements, but the terms of a psychological warfare campaign. The entity enjoyed the game almost as much as the feeding, taking pleasure in watching humans struggle against constraints designed to exploit their natural instincts and emotional responses. Chris spent 2 weeks researching the Morrison house, uncovering layers of tragedy that went far beyond the well-documented disappearances of 1923. Property records showed the house had been built on the site of an older structure that burned down in 1887, killing a family of 7. The fire had started mysteriously in the middle of the night, with witnesses reporting that they saw figures moving behind the windows even after the flames made survival impossible. Before that, the land had been part of a larger estate owned by the Caldwell family. In 1845, their daughter Mary had been found dead in her bedroom, her body positioned in front of a full-length mirror that showed no reflection despite being intact. Her fiancé, Thomas Morrison, was suspected of murder but never charged due to lack of evidence. The mirror from Mary's room had disappeared after her death, though local folklore claimed it had been incorporated into other reflective surfaces throughout the area. But the deeper Chris dug into the historical record, the more disturbing the pattern became. Every 50 to 60 years, people began disappearing near 1847 Elm Street. The victims were always young adults between the ages of 18 and 30, always found dead in rooms containing mirrors, always discovered in positions suggesting they had been staring at their own reflections when death came. The cyclical nature of the disappearances suggested something Chris had never encountered in his research: a supernatural entity that operated according to biological imperatives similar to those found in the natural world. Mary wasn't a restless spirit trapped by unfinished business or a demonic presence feeding on chaos and suffering. She was something that required periodic nourishment to maintain her existence in the mirror realm, something that had learned to time her activities to avoid sustained human attention. Chris realized he was looking at a feeding cycle that had been operating for over a century and a half. Mary would emerge during periods of heightened supernatural activity, claim her victims over the course of several months, then retreat into dormancy until the next cycle began. And according to his calculations, based on the timing of previous incidents and the increasing frequency of mirror-related phenomena in the area, the next feeding cycle was not only due to begin, but was already showing early signs of activation. Reports of unusual mirror behavior had been increasing throughout the region over the past 6 months. People complained of reflections that moved independently, voices that seemed to come from bathroom mirrors, and the persistent sensation of being watched while alone in rooms containing reflective surfaces. 3 people had died in mirror-related incidents within a 50-mile radius of 1847 Elm Street, each death bearing the hallmarks Chris had learned to recognize. The decision to investigate the Morrison house wasn't driven by scientific curiosity or professional obligation. Chris understood that he was walking into genuine danger, facing an entity that had successfully claimed dozens of victims over more than a century. But he also understood that this might be his only chance to find answers about Ben's death and to potentially prevent future tragedies. More than that, he was driven by guilt that had consumed him for 3 years. Every night he replayed that final phone conversation with Ben, imagining how different things might have been if he had taken his brother's fears seriously. Ben had been reaching out for help, trying to warn Chris about something genuinely dangerous, and Chris had dismissed him as delusional. His brother had died believing that no one understood what he was experiencing, that he was facing his terror alone. Chris couldn't save Ben, but he could validate his experience. He could prove that the supernatural phenomena Ben had described were real, that his brother's fear had been justified, that his death was not the result of mental illness, but murder by something that fed on human despair and confusion. The 2 weeks Chris spent preparing for his investigation of the Morrison house were filled with research that took him far beyond the comfortable realm of academic study into areas that challenged his understanding of reality itself. Eleanor's journal had provided a foundation, but Chris understood that survival would require a more comprehensive understanding of what he was likely to encounter. He reached out to Dr. Warren at Harvard, sharing Eleanor's account and requesting consultation on the psychological aspects of the entity's behavior. Dr. Warren's response arrived within hours, marked confidential, and written with an urgency that surprised Chris. "Mr. Thompson," her email began, "what you've described aligns with a phenomenon I've been studying for the past decade. I call it adaptive supernatural predation, entities that evolve their hunting strategies based on accumulated knowledge of human psychology. Your mirror woman appears to be one of the most sophisticated examples I've encountered. If you're determined to proceed with this investigation, you need to understand that you're not just dealing with a supernatural entity, but with something that has spent over a century studying how to kill people like you." Dr. Warren's research had identified several key characteristics of adaptive supernatural predators. They were highly intelligent, capable of complex planning and long-term strategy. They preferred psychological manipulation over direct confrontation, finding more nourishment in victims who participated in their own destruction. Most importantly, they were capable of learning from failed attempts, analysing what went wrong, and adjusting their approach for future encounters. "The rules you mentioned in Eleanor's journal," Dr. Warren continued, "are probably not arbitrary restrictions, but carefully designed psychological experiments. Each rule is likely intended to create stress, confusion, or conflict between the victim's instincts and their rational mind. The entity uses compliance with these rules to gather information about the victim's personality, fear responses, and decision-making patterns. By the time the victim realizes they're being studied, rather than tested, the entity has usually collected enough information to engineer their psychological breakdown." Father Santos provided a different but equally disturbing perspective. His experience with supernatural entities came from decades of performing exorcisms and spiritual cleansings, often in cases where conventional religious intervention had failed. He had encountered mirror-based entities before, though none as sophisticated as the one Chris was planning to face. "What you describe is not the ghost in any traditional sense," Father Santos wrote. "It sounds more like what medieval scholars called a specular demonium, a mirror demon. These entities exist primarily in the realm of reflection, a space that intersects with our physical world but operates according to different laws. They are among the most dangerous supernatural beings because they can observe us without being observed, learning our weaknesses while remaining safely removed from direct confrontation. Father Santos explained that mirror demons were thought to be fragments of human consciousness that had become trapped in reflective surfaces after traumatic deaths. Over time, these fragments accumulated knowledge and malevolence, eventually developing into independent entities capable of complex thought and planning. They maintained a connection to their original human nature, which made them particularly effective at manipulating living humans, but they had lost all empathy and moral restraint. If you must proceed with this investigation, Father Santos concluded, remember that you are not dealing with evil in any abstract sense. You are facing a corrupted human intelligence that understands exactly how to exploit your emotions, your fears, and your desires. It will use your love for your brother against you, twist your guilt into a weapon, and offer you exactly what you think you want most, in exchange for your soul. Armed with this consultation, Chris began gathering equipment that went far beyond Eleanor's simple supplies. He acquired electromagnetic field detectors capable of registering fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field, infrared cameras that could capture temperature variations invisible to the naked eye, and digital voice recorders designed to detect frequencies outside the normal range of human hearing. But he also packed the items Eleanor's journal specified: white candles made from pure beeswax and blessed by 3 different religious traditions, salt from the Dead Sea, a silver cross that had belonged to his grandfather, and a mechanical pocket watch that would function regardless of electromagnetic interference. Most importantly, Chris spent hours studying Eleanor's account, memorizing not just the rules she had recorded, but the psychological strategies she had used to survive the night. Eleanor had understood that following the rules perfectly wasn't enough. She had needed to maintain her sense of self while under supernatural assault, resist psychological manipulation designed to break down her identity, and make decisions based on rational analysis rather than emotional reaction. Chris also prepared contingency plans for scenarios Eleanor hadn't encountered. He researched the legal ownership of the property, identifying emergency contacts and escape routes. He informed Dr. Warren and Father Santos of his intended schedule, arranging for them to contact local authorities if he failed to check in at predetermined times. He even wrote detailed instructions for his landlord about handling his apartment and possessions in case he didn't return. But perhaps most importantly, Chris spent time preparing himself psychologically for what he was likely to encounter. He knew that Mary would use his guilt about Ben's death as a primary weapon, offering him the chance to communicate with his brother in exchange for compliance with increasingly dangerous demands. He practiced maintaining emotional distance from these offers, reminding himself that anything the entity showed him would be designed to manipulate rather than heal. On Wednesday evening, as rain began to fall across the countryside, Chris loaded his car with equipment and began the drive to 1847 Elm Street. The journey took him through increasingly rural areas, past farmland that seemed to grow more barren with each mile. The landscape felt wrong somehow, as if the natural order had been subtly disturbed by the presence of something that didn't belong in the physical world. The Morrison house appeared suddenly around a bend in the road, isolated behind a wrought iron fence whose gates hung permanently open. 2 stories of weathered colonial architecture rose from overgrown gardens, their windows boarded except for a single pane of glass on the second floor that caught the setting sun like a watching eye. The property was larger than Chris had expected, extending back into woods that seemed unusually dark despite the early evening hour. Chris parked across the street and spent an hour observing the house, documenting his approach with the same methodical precision that had made his blog a trusted resource among paranormal investigators. His electromagnetic field detectors registered massive fluctuations near the property line, readings that spiked beyond the instrument's capacity to measure. His infrared cameras showed temperature variations that defied meteorological explanation, cold spots that moved independently of wind patterns, warm areas that pulsed with rhythmic intensity. Most disturbing were the photographs. Even in fading daylight, every image Chris took of the house showed subtle abnormalities. Shadows fell in directions that didn't match the sun's position. The second-floor window reflected scenes that weren't visible from his vantage point. In several photographs, human figures appeared to be standing behind windows that should have been boarded shut. As full darkness approached, Chris noticed that the electromagnetic disturbances were intensifying. His equipment registered patterns that suggested some kind of supernatural awakening, as if the approaching night was activating forces that remained dormant during daylight hours. The temperature dropped noticeably, and the persistent sound of distant rain was occasionally interrupted by what sounded like voices calling from within the house. At 10:30 p.m, Chris gathered his equipment and approached the house. The back door, which Eleanor's journal had identified as the safest point of entry, opened with a grinding screech that echoed through empty rooms like a warning. Chris's flashlight revealed a house that time had claimed gradually, rather than suddenly. Family photographs still hung on water-stained walls, their subjects' faces obscured by decades of humidity and neglect. Furniture sat beneath white sheets that had yellowed with age, and Persian rugs had faded to colours that resembled dried blood. But it was the mirrors that commanded attention. They were everywhere throughout the house, ornate pieces that would have been valuable antiques, if not for their peculiar condition. Every single mirror showed signs of supernatural influence. The silver backing was tarnished around the edges, as if something corrosive had been eating away at the reflective surface from within. Hairline cracks formed patterns that looked almost like writing in an unknown language. Most disturbing, several mirrors showed reflections that didn't match the rooms Chris was standing in. Chris began his survey of the house, documenting each room and cataloguing every reflective surface. The layout was more complex than he had expected, with corridors that seemed to extend beyond the house's external dimensions and rooms that were larger inside than the building's architecture should have allowed. His electromagnetic detectors went wild in certain areas, particularly near mirrors and in the corners where shadows gathered most thickly. On the first floor, Chris counted 12 mirrors of various sizes, from a massive piece above the living room mantel to small decorative mirrors embedded in picture frames. Each one felt different, as if they were windows into separate dimensions rather than simple reflective surfaces. Some showed his image clearly, while others distorted his reflection in ways that couldn't be explained by the glass's curvature. The second floor contained 5 more mirrors, including the gateway mirror in the bathroom that Eleanor's journal had identified as the primary conduit between the physical world and Mary's realm. This mirror was magnificent, easily 4 feet tall, set in a frame carved from what looked like a single piece of ebony. Unlike the other mirrors, this one was perfectly clear, its surface so flawless, it seemed to contain actual depth rather than mere reflection. Chris set up his equipment with military precision, positioning cameras to capture multiple angles while avoiding direct reflection of the mirrors themselves. His electromagnetic detectors formed a perimeter around the bathroom, and he placed digital voice recorders in adjacent rooms to capture any sounds that might travel through the house's strange acoustics. Everything was connected to a central monitoring station he established in the hallway, allowing him to track supernatural activity throughout the house while maintaining his position near the gateway mirror. As midnight approached, Chris found himself studying his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at him appeared drawn and tired, aged by months of obsessive research and sleepless nights haunted by guilt. But there was something else in his expression now, a determination that went beyond scientific curiosity. He was here for Ben, for every person who had vanished into the world behind the mirrors, for answers that might finally allow the dead to rest. At 11:45 p.m, Chris lit the 3 beeswax candles Eleanor's journal specified, arranging them in a triangle that created interlocking shadows on the bathroom walls. The flames burned steadier than normal candles, their light somehow more substantial, as if they were burning something other than mere wax. The temperature in the bathroom dropped noticeably as the candles were lit, and Chris could see his breath beginning to form visible clouds. At 11:55 p.m, Chris conducted a final equipment check. All systems were functioning normally, though his electromagnetic detectors were registering increasingly intense fluctuations. The house itself seemed to be responding to the approaching ritual, creaking and settling in ways that suggested structural changes were occurring beyond the merely physical. At exactly midnight, Chris placed his palms against the gateway mirror's surface and spoke the words that had echoed through the house for over a century. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. The response to Chris's summoning was immediate and overwhelming in ways that Eleanor's journal had failed to adequately convey. Every piece of electronic equipment in the house activated simultaneously, cameras clicking rapidly, voice recorders whirring at maximum speed, electromagnetic detectors screaming warnings that pierced the midnight silence. The sound was like a technological symphony of terror, each device responding to supernatural forces that operated beyond the normal electromagnetic spectrum. The temperature in the bathroom plummeted so rapidly that frost began forming on the fixtures within seconds. Chris's breath became thick clouds that hung in the air longer than physics should have allowed, and the water in the sink's trap began to freeze with sharp cracking sounds. The candle flames shifted from yellow to deep blue, their light taking on qualities that illuminated without providing warmth. But it was Chris's reflection that underwent the most dramatic transformation. Instead of the simple aging progression Eleanor had described, his mirror image began to split and multiply. The glass showed a dozen different versions of himself. A child Chris staring back with innocent eyes untouched by tragedy. A teenage Chris filled with adolescent uncertainty and hope. An elderly Chris bearing the weight of decades he hadn't yet lived. And other versions that seemed to represent paths his life might have taken under different circumstances. Each reflection moved independently, some reaching towards the glass with desperate longing, others backing away in terror from something they could see but Chris couldn't. The child version was crying silently, tears that left no trace on the glass. The elderly version's mouth moved constantly, as if trying to impart crucial information across an impossible barrier. Most disturbing was a version of Chris that looked exactly as he did now but bore wounds that covered his face and hands, deep cuts that bled without healing, eyes that held knowledge of pain beyond human endurance. Then she appeared. Mary materialized not behind Chris's reflections but within them, occupying the same space as his various images until they seemed to merge into a single, impossible entity. She was breathtakingly beautiful, in the way that certain predators are beautiful, perfectly evolved for a purpose, every aspect of her appearance designed to inspire trust, desire, and fatal mistakes. She stood at least 6 feet tall, though her exact height seemed to shift depending on the viewing angle. Her hair was dark as midnight and moved as if floating in water, each strand perfectly placed to frame features that belonged in classical paintings. Her dress was from the Victorian era, deep burgundy silk that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, cut in a style that suggested both elegance and mourning, but it was her eyes that held Chris's attention. They were deep blue, almost violet, and contained depths that seemed to extend far beyond the physical possibilities of human anatomy. Looking into them was like staring into a vast ocean at night, beautiful, mysterious, and utterly without mercy. When she smiled, revealing teeth that were perfectly white and perfectly sharp, Chris felt his breath catch in his throat. "Christopher Thompson," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in his bones and somehow echo from multiple directions simultaneously. "I've been waiting for you." Words began appearing on the mirror's surface, but not in the simple blood writing Eleanor had described. Instead, they seemed to be carved directly into the glass itself, each letter deep enough to cast shadows in the candlelight. The text was elegant, formal, written in a style that suggested legal documents or ancient contracts. The covenant of reflection being the terms and conditions for survival in the realm between mirrors. To those who summon the guardian of the between spaces, these are the terms of your survival. Each rule represents a facet of the covenant between mortal and immortal, flesh and reflection, truth and deception. Break any single rule and forfeit not merely your life but your soul's reflection for all eternity. Rule the first, maintain illumination throughout the hours of darkness. Should all flames die simultaneously, the darkness between mirrors shall claim you, and you shall burn forever in cold fire that provides no light. Rule the second. Speak only when spoken to directly by the guardian. Her questions require truth. Her statements require silence. Unprompted words grant her power over your voice, allowing her to speak through you to others who might answer her call. Rule the third. Never avert your gaze while the guardian manifests in any reflective surface. To look away is to invite her into the spaces you cannot see, granting her dominion over your blind spots, both literal and metaphorical. Rule the fourth. Each hour until dawn breaks upon this mirror, visit every reflective surface in this dwelling. Count them carefully, for the number may change. Should additional mirrors appear, do not enter the room that contains the new reflection, for it leads to chambers that exist only in the between spaces. Rule the fifth. Accept no gifts from the guardian, regardless of how desperately they may be needed. Her generosity is always a trap, for gifts given in the mirror realm create debts that can only be paid with portions of your soul. Rule the sixth. After the summoning is complete, physical contact with any mirror surface will trap your essence within the glass, leaving your body as an empty vessel for the guardian to inhabit as she pleases. Rule the seventh. Count all sounds that repeat throughout the night. Should you reach 100 of any single noise, that room becomes the guardian's domain, and she may manifest physically within its boundaries. Rule the eighth. Maintain constant vigilance throughout the hours of darkness. To sleep is to dream, and to dream in the guardian's presence is to invite possession that may continue beyond waking. Rule the ninth. Ignore all manifestations that appear in your peripheral vision. They exist solely to distract from real threats, drawing your attention away from the guardian's true movements and intentions. Rule the 10th. Respond to knocking at doors or windows only when it comes in sequences of 3. All other patterns herald deceptions, illusions meant to lure you into breaking other rules or abandoning your protective preparations. Rule the 11th. Consume nothing within these walls throughout the night. The Guardian's realm recognizes no earthly sustenance, and those who eat or drink in her presence bind themselves to her domain through the most ancient of laws. Rule the 12th. When the Guardian requests identification, provide falsehood rather than truth. Your true name grants her dominion over your reflection, allowing her to control your image in every mirror throughout the world. Rule the 13th. Should compulsion to break any rule arise within you, resist for precisely 4 minutes by mechanical timepiece. The Guardian's influence over mortal will wane with sustained opposition, but only if that opposition is maintained for the full duration specified. As Chris read each rule, Mary nodded approvingly from within the mirror, her reflection somehow more vivid and substantial than his own. The text glowed briefly as his eyes passed over each line, as if the very act of reading was binding him to the covenant's terms. When he finished, she stepped forward until her face was mere inches from the glass, her breath fogging the mirror from within in a way that should have been physically impossible. "Christopher Thompson," she repeated, her voice now carrying undertones of amusement and anticipation. "Brother to Benjamin, son of Robert and Claire, seeker of truths that mortals were never meant to discover. You've come seeking answers about your sibling's fate, believing that understanding his death might somehow redeem your failure to save him." Chris felt his blood freeze as Mary demonstrated knowledge that she shouldn't possess. His family's names weren't connected to any of his research, weren't mentioned in any documents related to the Morrison house or its history. The realization that she had been watching him, studying him, preparing for this encounter long before he had decided to summon her, filled him with a dread that went beyond mere fear. "Benjamin called to me on his final night," Mary continued, her voice soft with mock sympathy that made her words even more cruel. "He reached across the spaces between mirrors, begging for understanding, for proof that the visions plaguing him were real, rather than symptoms of the mental illness your family was so eager to diagnose. I showed him the truth of reflection, how every mirror holds not just the image of those who look into it, but their essence, their deepest fears, their most cherished hopes." The mirror's surface began to shift, showing scenes that Chris recognized with growing horror. Ben in their childhood bathroom, staring at his reflection with increasing desperation as dark shapes moved behind the glass. Ben in his apartment, covering every mirror with towels and sheets, trying to escape visions that followed him, regardless of his precautions. Ben on that final night, standing in the same bathroom where Chris had found his body, tears streaming down his face as he begged his reflection for answers. He saw himself as he truly was, Mary explained, her voice filled with the satisfaction of an artist describing a masterpiece. Not the broken young man struggling with chemical imbalances and social anxiety, but a soul bright enough to illuminate the darkness between worlds. He understood that what your family called mental illness was actually sensitivity to realms beyond mortal perception. Chris watched in helpless horror as the mirror replayed his brother's final moments. Ben standing before the bathroom mirror, his reflection showing not his physical form but something brighter, more substantial. Mary appearing beside Ben's image, beautiful and terrible, offering comfort and understanding that no living person had been able to provide. "I didn't force him to make that final choice," Mary said softly, her words cutting through Chris's heart like razors. "I simply showed him what lay beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. The rope was his decision, but the peace he found was my gift. He chose to join the reflection rather than continue living with the knowledge of what awaited in the spaces between mirrors." "You murdered him," Chris whispered, forgetting the rule about speaking only when directly addressed. Mary's smile widened, revealing more of those perfectly sharp teeth. "I liberated him. And in time, Christopher, you'll understand that liberation and death are often the same thing. But enough philosophy for now. The rules are in effect, and the night is young. You have until the sun touches this mirror at dawn to prove yourself worthy of the answers you seek. Follow my covenant perfectly, and you may leave with knowledge of your brother's true fate, fail in even the smallest detail." She gestured to the space around her within the mirror, and Chris saw them clearly for the first time. Dozens of faces pressed against the inner surface of the glass, mouths open in silent screams, eyes wide with eternal terror. At the front of the crowd, looking peaceful and content, in a way Chris had never seen during his life, stood Ben. "The choice is yours, Christopher," Mary said as her reflection began to fade. "But remember, the covenant is already sealed. You summoned me, accepted my terms by reading them, and now you must see the game through to its conclusion. There is no leaving this house until dawn, no abandoning the ritual once begun. You may only survive or join the reflection." The mirror returned to normal, showing only Chris's pale, terrified face staring back at himself. But the rules remained carved into the glass, their letters deep and permanent, a constant reminder of the supernatural contract he had entered. His equipment registered massive electromagnetic disturbances throughout the house, and his thermal cameras showed temperature variations that suggested presence and movement in rooms that should have been empty. Chris checked his grandfather's pocket watch, 12:17 a.m. He had 6 hours and 43 minutes until dawn. 6 hours and 43 minutes to follow 13 rules perfectly while under assault from an entity that had spent over a century perfecting techniques for psychological manipulation and supernatural predation. The game had begun, and Chris was playing by rules designed to ensure his failure. The first hour after the summoning passed in relative calm, a deceptive piece that Chris recognized from Eleanor's journal as one of Mary's most effective psychological weapons. She allowed her victims time to process what they had experienced, to convince themselves that perhaps the encounter hadn't been as terrifying as it seemed, that they might actually be capable of surviving until dawn. This false confidence made the later, more intensive attacks all the more devastating. Chris used this grace period to conduct his first systematic survey of the house, moving through each room with methodical precision, while his equipment registered supernatural activity that seemed to ebb and flow like supernatural tides. The electromagnetic readings were strongest near mirrors and in corners where shadows gathered most thickly, but they pulsed with rhythmic intensity that suggested some kind of underlying pattern or intelligence. In the living room, the mantel mirror showed Mary standing in what appeared to be a different version of the same space. The furniture was arranged differently. The walls were painted in colours that didn't match the current decor, and family photographs showed faces Chris didn't recognise. Mary moved through this alternate space with casual familiarity, sometimes pausing to adjust decorative objects or study the photographs of people who had once lived in the house. In the dining room's china cabinet, the reflective glass showed Mary sitting at a formal dinner table, dining with guests who flickered in and out of visibility. She ate with deliberate elegance, cutting food that left no crumbs, drinking from glasses that never emptied. Occasionally she would look up from her meal and nod in Chris's direction, as if acknowledging his observation while demonstrating her complete comfort in this strange mirror realm. Most disturbing was the hallway mirror, which showed Mary ascending and descending a staircase that existed in no version of the house Chris had explored. She moved up and down these impossible stairs in an endless loop, each journey taking her to different floors, different time periods, different versions of the Morrison house that had existed across the decades. Chris documented each manifestation with photographs and video, though his cameras captured only empty mirrors reflecting the abandoned rooms exactly as they appeared to his naked eyes. Whatever Mary was showing him existed in a spectrum of reality that his equipment couldn't register, visible only to human consciousness, that had been altered by the summoning ritual. At 1 a.m. exactly, Chris began his first official mirror check as required by the fourth rule. He moved systematically through the house, counting each reflective surface while noting any changes from his initial survey. The count remained at 17 mirrors, just as he had documented before the summoning, but several of the mirrors now showed subtle differences. The master bedroom's vanity mirror, which had been cracked in a spiderweb pattern, now showed hairline fractures that formed what looked like writing in an unknown language. The bathroom mirror in the hall powder room, previously clear except for age spots, now bore fingerprints on the inner surface of the glass, impressions that couldn't be cleaned because they existed within the mirror itself rather than on its surface. Most unsettling was a small hand mirror he found on the kitchen counter, a piece he was certain hadn't been there during his initial survey. The mirror was antique, probably from the same period as the house's construction, with an ornate silver handle tarnished black with age. When Chris looked into it, he saw not his own reflection but Ben's face, his brother's expression peaceful and content, in a way Chris had never seen during Ben's life. Ben's reflection mouthed words Chris couldn't hear, gestures that seemed urgent and important. Chris wanted desperately to pick up the mirror, to examine it more closely, to somehow communicate with the image of his brother, but he remembered the 6th rule about physical contact with mirror surfaces and forced himself to leave the kitchen without touching the antique piece. At 1:30 a.m., while Chris was documenting temperature variations in the 2nd floor hallway, Mary's voice emerged from the gateway mirror with crystalline clarity. "You look tired, Christopher. The weight of truth is heavy, isn't it? Carrying your brother's death like a stone in your chest, wondering if things might have been different if you had just listened to his fears instead of dismissing them as symptoms." A crystal glass filled with clear liquid appeared on the bathroom counter, condensation beading on its surface as if freshly poured from some Arctic spring. The water looked impossibly pure, more transparent than any liquid Chris had ever seen, and the mere sight of it made him realize how desperately thirsty he had become. "This is water from the mountain streams where Benjamin used to hike," Mary continued, her voice filled with false compassion. "He told me about those trails during our conversations, how peaceful he felt in the wilderness before the voices started following him home. Just a small drink, to clear your mind, help you think more clearly about what you've learned tonight." Chris felt his throat constrict with genuine thirst, made worse by the stress of the supernatural encounter and the dry heat generated by his equipment. The water seemed to glow with its own inner light, promising relief not just from physical discomfort but from the emotional weight he had carried for 3 years. "No, thank you," Chris said, his voice hoarse with the effort of refusal. "Are you certain?" Mary's reflection leaned forward in the mirror, her beautiful face filled with concern that seemed almost genuine. "The night has many hours remaining, and your body needs sustenance to maintain the mental clarity required for survival. This water is pure, blessed by natural forces far older than my presence in this realm. It would do you no harm." Chris felt the pull of her offer like a physical force, his rational mind constructing arguments for why accepting this gift might be reasonable. The water looked harmless, even beneficial. Mary's explanation seemed logical. His growing thirst was becoming a genuine distraction from his need to focus on following the rules. "No thank you," Chris repeated, fighting against the supernatural compulsion with conscious effort. Mary's expression darkened slightly, the mask of compassion slipping to reveal something predatory underneath. "As you wish, Christopher, but the offer remains available throughout the night. When the hours grow long, your resolve weakens. When the weight of your failures becomes too heavy to bear alone, remember that I can provide what you need most." "No, thank you," Chris said for the 3rd time, and the glass vanished as if it had never existed. But the thirst remained, growing stronger as the night progressed. At 2 a.m, Chris began hearing sounds from other parts of the house. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the floor above him. The rhythm was hypnotic, almost like a heartbeat or the steady tick of a clock, and Chris found himself unconsciously synchronizing his own breathing to the pattern. Following the 7th rule, Chris began counting automatically. Step, step, step. The sound was clearly audible, echoing through the house's strange acoustics in ways that suggested the footsteps were being made by someone of substantial weight and size. But according to his equipment, the 2nd floor showed no signs of physical presence, no electromagnetic disturbances, no temperature variations, no infrared signatures that would indicate an actual intruder. As the count climbed higher, Chris's anxiety increased proportionally. There was something deeply unsettling about the mechanical regularity of the sound, the way it never varied in tempo or intensity. Step, step, step. By the time he reached 50 steps, his heart was racing with irrational fear. At 75 steps, he was sweating despite the cold air that seemed to permeate the house. At 90 steps, Chris realized that the footsteps were slowly increasing in volume, as if whatever was making them was gradually moving closer to the stairs. At 95 steps, he could hear individual floorboards creaking under the weight of the invisible walker. At 97 steps, dust began falling from the ceiling above his head. Chris forced himself to leave the living room and move to the kitchen, where the sound immediately stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the footsteps had been, filled with the sense that something had been interrupted in the middle of an important task and was now waiting for him to return so it could continue. During his 2 a.m. mirror check, Chris discovered something that made his blood run cold. In the master bedroom's full-length mirror, Mary wasn't alone. A young man stood beside her, his face pale and peaceful, his eyes holding an expression of complete understanding and acceptance. It was Ben, but not as Chris remembered him from life. This version of his brother looked content, fulfilled, as if he had finally found the answers he had spent his final years seeking. Mary noticed Chris's recognition and smiled with genuine warmth, the first authentic emotion he had seen her display. "He's been asking about you, Christopher, wondering when you would finally come seeking the truth about what happened that night. He says you blame yourself for his death, that you carry guilt like a stone in your chest. He wants you to know that his choice wasn't your failure." Ben's reflection turned toward Chris and mouthed words that looked like, "I'm sorry, and not your fault." His brother's image moved with fluid grace, no longer bearing the signs of anxiety and depression that had marked his final years. This version of Ben seemed to have found peace, clarity, and understanding that had eluded him in life. "Would you like to speak with him?" Mary asked, her voice soft with invitation. "He has so much to tell you about what lies beyond the boundaries of mortal existence. He could help you understand that death isn't an ending, but a transformation into something greater." Chris wanted desperately to respond, to have the conversation with Ben that death had made impossible, to finally ask for forgiveness and receive the absolution that he had sought for 3 years. But he remembered the second rule about speaking only when directly addressed with questions, and he forced himself to remain silent. "Perhaps later," Mary said, her tone suggesting she could read his thoughts as easily as his expressions. "The night is young, and there's so much more to show you. Benjamin will wait. After all, we have eternity to spend together." At 2:30 a.m, Chris began noticing changes in his peripheral vision that challenged his sanity as much as his resolve to follow the 9th rule. Shadows moved independently of his flashlight beam, flowing along the walls like liquid darkness. Furniture shifted when he wasn't looking directly at it, chairs turning to face him, tables repositioning themselves to create new pathways through the rooms. The family photographs were the worst. Chris could see them moving in his peripheral vision, the subjects' faces turning to track his movement through the house. Children who had been smiling innocently would show expressions of fear or accusation when glimpsed from the corner of his eye. Adults who had posed formally would appear to be pointing at him, their mouths open as if shouting warnings he couldn't hear. Following Eleanor's 9th rule, Chris forced himself to focus straight ahead, but the effort was exhausting. Every instinct screamed at him to look directly at the movement, to confront whatever was happening in his blind spots. The supernatural activity was designed to create paranoia and anxiety, to wear down his mental defenses through constant low-level stress. But worse than the movement itself was the growing certainty that something was following him through the house. Chris could feel eyes watching him from behind, could sense a presence that moved when he moved, stopped when he stopped, maintained a constant distance that kept it just outside his direct vision. His equipment registered no additional presence, but his instincts insisted that he was no longer alone in the house. At 3 a.m, Chris conducted his third mirror check and found that Mary now appeared in multiple reflective surfaces simultaneously, her form taking up the entire space within each mirror. She no longer seemed confined to the glass, but moved freely within what looked like parallel versions of the house, each slightly different from the physical structure Chris occupied. In the bathroom gateway mirror, Mary stood in what appeared to be the same room, but during a different time period. The fixtures were newer, the walls freshly painted, and sunlight streamed through windows that were boarded shut in Chris's version of reality. Mary moved through this alternate bathroom with casual familiarity, using a sink that worked, opening cabinets that contained fresh towels and toiletries. In the living room, mantel mirror, Mary entertained guests in what looked like a formal parlour from the Victorian era. She served tea from china that gleamed with newness, conversed with people who flickered in and out of visibility, laughed at jokes Chris couldn't hear. The scene had a warmth and domesticity that made the abandoned house seem even more desolate by comparison. In the dining room china cabinet, Mary sat at a feast that seemed to stretch on forever. The table was laden with foods from different time periods and cultures, dishes that appeared and disappeared as she reached for them. She ate with obvious pleasure, savouring flavours that seemed to nourish her in ways that went beyond mere physical sustenance. You see how pleasant existence can be in the space between mirrors. Mary's voice came from every reflective surface at once, creating a chorus that filled the house. Here, time moves differently. Past and present exist simultaneously. Those who join the reflection find peace, purpose, and pleasures that mortal life could never provide. Chris realized that Mary was showing him visions designed to make death seem appealing, to convince him that joining her realm would be liberation rather than destruction. The strategy was sophisticated, targeting his emotional vulnerabilities while offering exactly what his guilt-ridden psyche craved most: reunion with Ben and freedom from the weight of responsibility for his brother's death. At 3:30 a.m, knocking came from multiple locations throughout the house. The pattern was complex but unmistakable. Knock, knock, knock from the front door. Pause. Knock, knock, knock from the kitchen window. Pause. Knock, knock, knock from the second floor window directly above Chris's head. 3 sets of 3 knocks, coming from different directions but maintaining perfect synchronization, requiring a response according to the 10th rule. "Who's there?" Chris called out, his voice echoing through the empty rooms. "It's Ben," came the reply from all 3 locations simultaneously, and Chris's heart nearly stopped. The voice was perfect, exactly his brother's tone, inflection, and speech patterns, down to the slight lisp Ben had never quite outgrown. "Chris, I need to talk to you. I need to explain what really happened that night, why I made the choice I made." Every instinct screamed at Chris to respond, to open one of the doors or windows and finally have the conversation with his brother that death had cut short. The voice carried all the warmth and affection that had characterized their relationship, along with an urgency that suggested this might be his only chance for contact. "Please," the voice continued, becoming more desperate and emotionally manipulative. "I don't have much time before she takes control again. This might be my only chance to tell you the truth about what she showed me, about why joining the reflection seemed like the only escape from the voices and the visions." Chris remained silent, though every word felt like a knife twisting in his chest. This was exactly the conversation he had dreamed of having for 3 years. The chance to ask Ben for forgiveness and to understand what had driven his brother to that final, irreversible decision. "I know you blame yourself," the voice continued, now coming from inside the house rather than from outside the doors and windows. "I know you think you failed me by not taking my fears seriously, but Christopher, you couldn't have saved me. What she showed me was bigger than anything you could have understood. The voices weren't symptoms of mental illness. They were calls from beyond the boundaries of mortal existence." The voice was now coming from the mirrors themselves, Ben's words echoing from every reflective surface in the house. "She's not evil, Christopher. She's a teacher, a guide who helps people transition from the limitations of physical existence to the freedom of the mirror realm. I chose to join her because I finally understood what I was meant to become." Chris covered his ears, but the voice seemed to come from inside his own head now, bypassing his physical senses entirely. "Don't make the same mistakes you made with me, big brother. Don't dismiss what you're experiencing as supernatural tricks or psychological manipulation. This is real, and it's beautiful, and it's the answer to every question that's tortured you since you found my body." The pleading continued for several more minutes, Ben's voice becoming increasingly desperate and emotionally devastating. But something felt wrong about the speech patterns, the way Ben's voice was constructing arguments that sounded more like Mary's philosophical perspectives than his brother's natural way of thinking. The real Ben had been emotional, impulsive, driven by feeling rather than logic. This voice was too calculated, too focused on specific psychological pressure points. Chris remained silent, and after what felt like an eternity, the voices stopped. But for the rest of the hour, he could hear movement around the outside of the house. Footsteps circling the building, testing windows, trying door handles, always just out of sight when he checked his equipment's feeds. At 4 a.m, Mary's manifestations became more aggressive and physically threatening. She no longer stayed politely within the confines of the mirrors, but pressed against the glass from within, her hands leaving prints that remained visible even after she moved to other reflections. The barrier between the mirror world and physical reality seemed to be thinning, as if prolonged exposure to her presence was weakening the boundaries that normally kept the two realms separate. In the bathroom gateway mirror, Mary began showing Chris scenes from Ben's final weeks that no living person should have been able to witness. His brother, alone in their childhood bedroom, staring into the dresser mirror while having conversations with his reflection that grew increasingly desperate. Ben in his apartment bathroom, covering every mirror with towels and sheets, trying to escape visions that followed him, regardless of his precautions. Most devastating were the scenes from Ben's final night. Chris watched in helpless horror as the mirror replayed his brother's last hours in excruciating detail. Ben standing in the bathroom, tears streaming down his face, begging his reflection for answers while his image showed someone else entirely. A version of Ben that was calm, confident, and filled with supernatural knowledge. "He saw the truth before the end," Mary explained, her voice coming from multiple mirrors simultaneously while the scenes continued to unfold. How reflection shows us not just what we are in the physical world, but what we could become in realms beyond mortal limitations. He understood that what your family called mental illness was actually sensitivity to dimensions of existence that most humans never perceive. Chris watched Ben's reflection change, showing his brother not as the anxious, depressed young man struggling with chemical imbalances, but as something brighter, more substantial, more real than his physical form. Mary appeared beside Ben's transformed image, offering comfort and understanding that no living person had been able to provide. "I didn't force him to make that final choice," Mary said softly, her words cutting through Chris's heart like razors. "I simply showed him what lay beyond the boundaries of mortal existence, what peace and clarity waited those brave enough to step through the mirror into something greater. The rope was his decision, but the understanding was my gift." He chose to join the reflection rather than continue living with the knowledge of what awaited him in both worlds, Mary continued. Physical death was just the transition point, the moment when his consciousness moved from the limited vessel of flesh into the unlimited potential of the mirror realm. At 4:30 a.m, Chris felt the first major compulsion of the night, a supernatural force that made his earlier experience with thirst seem trivial by comparison. It started as a simple desire to touch the gateway mirror's surface to trace the outline of Ben's face in the glass and somehow make contact with his brother's transformed consciousness. But it quickly grew into an overwhelming need that seemed to operate on a level deeper than conscious thought. Chris set his grandfather's mechanical watch for 4 minutes and gripped his hands together, fighting against the supernatural influence with every ounce of will he possessed. The compulsion was unlike anything he had ever experienced. Not just psychological pressure, but a physical force that seemed to be pulling him towards the mirror at the cellular level. His muscles moved without conscious direction, his arms extending toward the glass, while his rational mind screamed warnings about the 6th rule. The pull was so strong that Chris had to brace himself against the bathroom door frame to avoid being drawn forward into contact with the mirror's surface. Mary's laughter filled the house as he struggled, the sound echoing from every reflective surface with malicious joy. "You're stronger than most, Christopher, but strength alone won't save you from what you truly want. I've had over a century to perfect my understanding of human nature, to learn what motivates each type of visitor who enters my domain." The mirror began showing Chris visions of what would happen if he gave in to the compulsion. His hand passing through the glass like water, Mary's fingers wrapping around his wrist, pulling him into a world where Ben waited with open arms and explanations for everything that had happened. The visions were so vivid that Chris could feel the cool touch of the mirror's surface against his palm, could sense his brother's presence just beyond the glass. Ben was driven by pain and confusion, easy to manipulate through offers of comfort and understanding, Mary continued, her voice becoming hypnotic and persuasive. But you, Christopher, are driven by guilt and the need for redemption. You want to save your brother, to prove that his death wasn't meaningless, to finally have the conversation that might heal the wound his suicide left in your heart. The 4 minutes stretched into subjective eternity as Chris fought against forces that operated beyond the normal boundaries of physics and psychology. His equipment registered electromagnetic disturbances that should have been lethal, temperature fluctuations that defied thermodynamics, and gravitational anomalies that suggested reality itself was being manipulated around the mirror. But Chris held firm, using techniques Eleanor's journal had suggested for maintaining psychological resistance under supernatural assault. He focused on concrete details, the feeling of his grandfather's watch in his pocket, the sound of his own breathing, the physical sensation of his feet against the bathroom floor. He recited multiplication tables, sang songs from his childhood, and forced himself to remember mundane details from his daily life that had nothing to do with supernatural phenomena. When his watch finally chimed, the compulsion vanished instantly, leaving Chris shaking and exhausted but still in control of his own actions. Mary's laughter stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that felt heavier and more threatening than any sound. "Impressive," Mary said finally, her voice carrying a note of genuine respect mixed with growing irritation. "You have more discipline than most who enter my domain. But the night is far from over, Christopher, and I have many more tests prepared for you. Each hour will bring stronger compulsions, more sophisticated temptations, greater opportunities for failure." At 5 a.m, Chris conducted his 5th mirror check and discovered that the nature of Mary's manifestations had changed dramatically. She now appeared in every reflective surface simultaneously, her form taking up the entire space within each mirror, while moving freely through what looked like parallel versions of the house from different time periods. In the bathroom gateway mirror, Mary stood in the same room, but during the house's construction in 1887. Chris could see workers moving in the background, installing fixtures and hanging wallpaper, while Mary supervised with proprietary interest. She moved through this construction-era version of the house as if she owned it, directing the workers' efforts and occasionally running her fingers along the mirror frames with obvious satisfaction. In the living room mantel mirror, Mary hosted what appeared to be a funeral reception from the 1920s. Dozens of people in period dress gathered around her, their faces showing grief and confusion, while Mary offered comfort with practiced ease. Chris recognized some of the faces from photographs he had seen during his research. They were the families of the children who had disappeared in 1923. In the dining room china cabinet, Mary sat across from a young woman who looked remarkably similar to the photographs Chris had seen of Mary Caldwell, the woman who had allegedly been murdered in 1845. The two women appeared to be having an intense conversation, sometimes arguing, sometimes embracing, as if they were working through some ancient conflict. "You see the scope of my existence." Mary's voice came from every mirror at once, creating a chorus that filled the house with supernatural harmonics. "I am not bound by the linear progression of time that limits mortal consciousness. In the mirror realm, past and present exist simultaneously, allowing me to move freely through all the moments that have ever occurred in this place." Chris realized that Mary was showing him the true extent of her power, demonstrating that she wasn't just a supernatural entity trapped in mirrors, but something that existed across multiple dimensions of time and space. She had been present during every tragedy that had occurred at 1847 Elm Street, not just as an observer, but as an active participant who had orchestrated events to serve her own purposes. "Every person who has died in this house, every soul who has vanished into the mirror realm, continues to exist within my domain," Mary continued. "They are not dead in any meaningful sense. They have simply transitioned to a form of existence that transcends the limitations of physical reality. They serve my purposes, help me understand new visitors, provide information about the world beyond these walls." The mirrors began showing Chris brief glimpses of the missing people from throughout the house's history. Children from the 1920s playing games that involved moving between mirrors. Adults from various time periods working on projects that seemed to involve maintaining or expanding the mirror realm. All of them looked content, purposeful, as if they had found meaning in their transformed existence. But there was something wrong with their movements, something mechanical and lifeless about their interactions. They moved like people following scripts, rather than acting from genuine motivation. And their eyes held an emptiness that suggested their consciousness had been altered in fundamental ways. At 5:30 a.m, Chris checked his pocket watch and felt a surge of desperate hope. He had survived over 5 hours of supernatural assault, following every rule perfectly, despite temptations and compulsions designed to exploit his deepest psychological vulnerabilities. Dawn was less than an hour away, and the eastern windows were already showing the faintest hint of grey that suggested sunrise was approaching. For the first time since the summoning began, Chris allowed himself to feel something approaching confidence. He had succeeded where dozens of others had failed, had outsmarted a supernatural entity that had claimed victims for over a century. His research had been correct, Eleanor's rules had been accurate, and his own discipline had proven sufficient to survive until dawn. As confidence replaced fear, Chris began to experience something he hadn't felt since Ben's death: genuine pride in his own accomplishment. He had done something extraordinary, something that validated all his research and proved that supernatural phenomena could be understood and overcome through careful preparation and disciplined execution. The realization that he was going to survive filled Chris with a satisfaction that went beyond mere relief. He had beaten Mary at her own game, followed her rules flawlessly, and earned the right to leave with answers about Ben's death and knowledge that could help future investigators avoid similar tragedies. At 5:45 a.m, Mary appeared in the gateway mirror one final time, her form more solid and present than it had ever been during the night. The barrier between the mirror world and physical reality seemed paper-thin now, as if the prolonged supernatural activity had weakened the boundaries that normally kept the two realms separate. "Christopher," she said, a voice carrying a note of genuine respect that made her words even more dangerous. "You have exceeded my expectations in every possible way. You followed my rules with remarkable precision, shown discipline that few mortals possess, and demonstrated understanding of supernatural phenomena that rivals my own knowledge. Mary stepped closer to the mirror's surface, her reflection becoming so vivid that she seemed to exist in the bathroom rather than behind the glass. You've proven yourself worthy of the truth, worthy of the answers you came seeking. But I have one final question for you, one last test that will determine whether you leave this house with knowledge or join the reflection with understanding. Chris waited, remembering that he should only respond when directly addressed with a question. The silence stretched between them, heavy with anticipation and the weight of everything that had happened during the night. "What is your true name?" Mary asked, her eyes boring into him through the glass, with an intensity that seemed to reach into his soul. This was it, the final test before dawn. Chris felt triumph flooding through him as he prepared to give the false name he had used earlier in the night. After hours of deception and careful rule-following, he was moments away from victory. But then something shifted in his mind. A change so subtle that he almost didn't notice it happening. After surviving the longest, most terrifying night of his life, after following Mary's rules perfectly, despite temptations designed to break his will, the idea of giving another false name felt wrong somehow. He had accomplished something extraordinary, something that deserved recognition and acknowledgement. Why should he have to hide his identity when he had earned the right to claim credit for his success? Chris had spent 3 years researching supernatural phenomena, had risked his life to seek answers about Ben's death, had followed every rule perfectly, despite psychological torture designed to break stronger people than himself. He deserved to be recognized for his achievement, to have his name associated with this victory over forces that had claimed dozens of previous victims. More than that, giving a false name felt like a betrayal of everything he had accomplished. He had come to this house seeking truth, had endured hours of supernatural assault in pursuit of answers, had proven himself worthy of knowledge that could revolutionize paranormal research. Why should he diminish his achievement by hiding behind a lie when honesty had brought him this far? The false name died on Chris's lips as pride swelled in his chest. After months of guilt and self-doubt, after watching his brother's death rip his family apart, after questioning every decision he had made since finding Ben's body, Chris had finally done something meaningful. He had succeeded where others had failed, had outsmarted an ancient predator through discipline and intelligence, had earned the right to claim his victory openly. "My name is Chris," he said proudly, his voice ringing with confidence and satisfaction. "Chris Thompson. I've followed every one of your rules perfectly, and I've won your game." Mary's smile became radiant, beautiful, and absolutely terrifying. Her expression transformed from respect to triumph, from admiration to predatory satisfaction. "No, Christopher. Earlier tonight, when I first asked for your identity, you told me your name was Aaron. You've just broken the 12th rule. You've given me your true name, and in doing so, you've granted me dominion over your reflection." The realization hit Chris like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs and the strength from his legs. The rule about false identification wasn't just about the first interaction. It applied to every question about identity throughout the night. By proudly claiming his real name, he had violated the very rule that might have saved him, giving Mary exactly what she needed to claim his soul. "You see," Mary continued, her voice filled with gentle mockery that made her words even more cruel, "I don't simply trap people through fear or confusion, though those techniques have their place. The truly satisfying victories come from pride, from the moment when someone believes they've outsmarted forces beyond their comprehension and demands recognition for their achievement." Chris stared at his reflection in the mirror, watching as his image began to change. His face aged rapidly, showing him as an old man, then a corpse, then something beyond death entirely. The transformation was irreversible, unstoppable, the result of his own fatal decision to claim credit for his survival. "You played my game perfectly, Christopher," Mary said, her voice filled with satisfaction, "right up until you decided that you deserved acknowledgement for your success. Pride, as they say, comes before the fall, and your fall will be more satisfying than most because you brought it upon yourself through the very qualities that made you an interesting opponent." The mirrors throughout the house began to crack, spiderweb fractures spreading across every reflective surface. But instead of shattering, the cracks seemed to be opening pathways, creating doorways between the mirror world and physical reality. The boundaries that had separated the two realms throughout the night were collapsing, allowing Mary to step fully into the physical world for the first time in decades. Mary emerged from the gateway mirror like water flowing upward, her form becoming solid as she stepped into the bathroom. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that frost formed on every surface, and the candles guttered in wind that came from directions that shouldn't have existed in an enclosed space. She was no longer beautiful in the ethereal way of supernatural entities. She was beautiful the way apex predators are beautiful, perfectly evolved for her purpose, every aspect of her presence designed to inspire awe, terror, and fatal mistakes. "I've been waiting so long for someone like you," Mary said, circling Chris like a shark that had finally cornered its prey. "Someone intelligent enough to understand the complexity of my rules, disciplined enough to follow them despite psychological pressure, but fundamentally human enough to want recognition for their achievement." Chris tried to run, but Mary moved with impossible speed, appearing in doorways and windows faster than human reflexes could track. Every mirror in the house showed her blocking his path, her form multiplied across dozens of reflective surfaces that created a maze of predatory images. The house itself seemed to shift around him, corridors stretching longer, rooms rearranging themselves to eliminate escape routes. "Your research was quite thorough," Mary continued conversationally as she pursued him through the changing architecture, "but you missed the most important detail about my nature and methods. I don't just feed on life force in the crude way that most supernatural parasites operate. I feed on potential. The brighter the mind, the greater the creativity. The stronger the will, the more satisfying the consumption." Chris found himself back in the bathroom, facing the gateway mirror that had started his nightmare. His reflection stared back at him, but something was fundamentally wrong with the image. It moved independently of his body, mouthing words he wasn't speaking, reaching towards the glass with desperation that his physical form didn't feel. The mirror showed his reflection trapped behind the glass, while his body remained in the physical world, a division that should have been impossible, but was happening nonetheless. "Your reflection is already mine," Mary explained with clinical detachment. "The moment you spoke your true name, it became part of my collection, separated from your physical form by the power you granted me through rule violation. But I'm offering you a choice, Christopher, because I've grown fond of you during our night together." Mary gestured towards the mirror, and Chris saw Ben standing beside his trapped reflection. His brother's face was filled with an expression Chris had never seen during Ben's life. Complete peace, total understanding, absolute acceptance of his transformed existence. Ben reached out toward Chris's reflection, offering comfort and companionship in the realm beyond the glass. "You can die here, in this bathroom, the way Benjamin died in yours," Mary said softly. "Your body will be found by whoever comes looking for you, another apparent suicide that authorities will attribute to the stress of paranormal investigation. Your family will mourn, your research will be dismissed as the obsessions of someone who descended into madness, and your death will change nothing." The alternative she presented was even more terrifying. Or you can step through the mirror willingly and join your reflection in the space between worlds. Live forever in a realm where time moves differently, where past and present exist simultaneously, where consciousness is freed from the limitations of flesh and bone. Help me understand future visitors, make their games more interesting, contribute your intelligence to something greater than individual existence. Chris looked at the mirror and saw dozens of faces pressed against the glass from within, victims from throughout the house's history, all of them looking peaceful and content in ways they probably hadn't achieved during their physical lives. They moved with purpose through spaces that defied physics, worked on projects that seemed to involve expanding and maintaining the mirror realm, interacted with each other in ways that suggested genuine community and understanding. But there was something wrong with their eyes, something hollow and mechanical about their movements. They looked like people following programs rather than making conscious choices, and their peaceful expression seemed frozen rather than genuine. Chris realized he was looking at consciousness that had been fundamentally altered, souls that had been transformed into something that served Mary's purposes rather than their own. "He's happy here," Mary said, gesturing towards Ben's image in the mirror. "No more chemical imbalances that your family never understood. No more voices that tormented him during his final years. No more confusion about his place in a world that never quite made sense to him. Just clarity, purpose, and eternal existence in service to something greater than individual human limitation." For a moment, Chris wavered. The weight of guilt he had carried since Ben's death, the endless questions about what he could have done differently, the fear that he would never find peace or redemption, all of it could end with a single step forward. He could finally have the conversation with Ben that death had made impossible, could exist in a realm where his research into supernatural phenomena would have unlimited scope and eternal duration. But then, Chris remembered why he had come to this house in the first place, not for redemption or peace, but for truth. And the truth was that Mary was a predator who had manipulated his brother into suicide, who had fed on Ben's pain and confusion until death seemed like the only escape from supernatural torment. The peaceful expression on Ben's face in the mirror wasn't enlightenment. It was the result of having his consciousness altered to serve Mary's purposes. "No," Chris said firmly, his voice carrying conviction that surprised even himself. "I won't give you what you want." Mary's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room dropped even further. Ice began forming on the bathroom fixtures, and the candle flames turned from blue to white as they burned colder and brighter. "You don't have a choice anymore, Christopher. Your reflection is mine, and where reflection goes, the body must follow. The laws that govern the space between mirrors are older and stronger than human will." The mirror began to exert a gravitational pull that dragged Chris toward its surface, creating a force that operated beyond normal physics. He fought against it, gripping the bathroom doorframe with both hands, but the pull was too strong. His feet left the floor as he was drawn inexorably towards the glass, towards his trapped reflection and the realm where Mary ruled supreme. "Don't fight it," Mary said, her voice almost kind, despite the cruelty of her actions. "The transition is easier if you don't resist. Many of my previous visitors struggled until the very end, making their transformation more painful than necessary. You can choose to join the reflection with dignity, rather than being dragged across the threshold against your will." Chris felt his hands beginning to pass through the mirror's surface, which had become liquid and responsive to touch like supernatural water. The sensation was like plunging into ice that burned, rather than froze, numbing and shocking simultaneously. He could see Ben on the other side of the glass, reaching out to help him across the threshold into whatever existence awaited beyond the physical world. But as Chris's body passed through the mirror, he made one last desperate choice. Instead of accepting the transition passively, he grabbed the sides of the mirror's ornate frame and pulled with all his remaining strength. The antique glass, weakened by decades of supernatural stress and the night's intense activity, finally reached its breaking point. The explosion of glass filled the bathroom with crystalline shards that caught and reflected the candlelight like 1,000 fallen stars. Each piece showed a different image. Chris's terrified face, Mary's rage and surprise, Ben's confusion as he suddenly found himself separated from the mirror realm, and dozens of other trapped souls being freed from their glass prison. The sound was like a symphony of breaking chains, reality reasserting itself as the primary gateway between worlds collapsed. Chris felt himself falling back into the physical world, cutting his hands on the broken glass as he landed hard on the bathroom floor. Blood ran down his arms from dozens of small wounds, but the pain was nothing compared to the relief of finding himself still in his own body, still in control of his own consciousness, still fundamentally human, despite everything he had experienced. Mary's scream of frustration echoed from every piece of shattered mirror, a sound that seemed to come from dimensions beyond normal space and time. Her form was already fading, losing coherence as her primary anchor to the physical world was destroyed. The carefully maintained connection between the mirror realm and the Morrison house was severing, cutting her off from the power source she had cultivated for over a century. "This isn't over," her voice whispered from the fragments scattered across the bathroom floor. "There are other mirrors, other gateways, other houses where the boundary between worlds is thin. I have eternity to plan my revenge, eternity to find you again, eternity to finish what was started here tonight." But even as Mary spoke, her presence was diminishing rapidly. The house felt different now, emptier, more normal, as if a weight that had pressed down on it for generations was finally lifting. The supernatural cold was dissipating, the electromagnetic disturbances were fading, and the oppressive atmosphere that had made every breath an effort was being replaced by something that felt almost like peace. Chris pulled himself to his feet, bleeding from dozens of small cuts, but alive and fundamentally unchanged by his encounter with forces that had destroyed so many before him. Through the bathroom window, he could see the first ray of dawn sunlight beginning to paint the eastern sky with shades of pink and gold. He had survived not by following Mary's rules perfectly, but by breaking the most important rule of all, accepting her dominion over his identity and reflection. As Chris gathered his equipment and prepared to leave the house that had nearly become his tomb, he caught sight of something that made his heart skip. In one of the larger mirror fragments, barely visible, in the growing dawn light, Ben's face appeared one final time. But this wasn't the peaceful, transformed version Mary had shown him throughout the night. This was his brother, as Chris remembered him from life. Anxious, uncertain, but fundamentally human and real. Ben's reflection mouthed two words that Chris could read clearly. "Thank you." Then the image faded, and Chris was left alone with the wreckage of Mary's century-long reign over the Morrison house. The other trapped souls were gone too, freed from their glass prison to whatever existence awaited, beyond both the physical world and Mary's artificial realm. The house was just a house again, abandoned and decaying, but no longer supernatural in any meaningful sense. The drive home took place in full daylight, the horrors of the night seeming almost impossible to believe in the rational light of morning. But Chris carried proof of his experience, hours of audio and video, recordings that captured electromagnetic disturbances science couldn't explain, thermal images that showed temperature variations beyond natural possibility, and most importantly, the knowledge that his brother's death hadn't been a simple suicide driven by mental illness. Ben had been murdered by something that fed on human despair and confusion, manipulated by an entity that understood exactly how to exploit the vulnerabilities created by depression and anxiety. His brother hadn't chosen to abandon his family. He had been systematically destroyed by a predator that had spent decades learning how to kill people like him. But Chris had also learned something else during his night in the mirror house. Mary's power came not from supernatural strength, but from human weakness. Pride, guilt, fear. and the desperate need for answers that made people willing to accept any explanation rather than live with uncertainty. She had been defeated, not by superior force, but by someone who ultimately chose destruction over domination, chaos over control. Over the following weeks, Chris worked tirelessly to document his experience at the Morrison house, creating a comprehensive guide for other investigators who might encounter similar entities. His account was different from anything that had been published before, detailed, scientific, and brutally honest about both the supernatural dangers and the human vulnerabilities that made such encounters deadly. Reflected Horrors became something more than a paranormal investigation blog. Chris transformed it into a clearinghouse for practical information about surviving supernatural encounters, a resource that attracted attention from researchers, law enforcement, and families of victims who had previously found no answers. He established a network of investigators dedicated to identifying and neutralizing supernatural threats, turning his personal tragedy into a force for protecting others. The Morrison house was demolished 6 months after Chris's investigation, though he had argued for preserving it as a research site. The local authorities decided that too many people had died there, that the building's reputation made it a magnet for dangerous amateur investigations. Chris understood their reasoning, but he also knew that destroying the physical structure didn't necessarily eliminate the supernatural forces that had operated there. Mary had been weakened by the destruction of her primary gateway, but not destroyed. Chris continued to receive reports of mirror-related phenomena from across the region, reflections that moved independently, voices that seemed to come from bathroom mirrors, and the persistent sensation of being watched while alone in rooms containing reflective surfaces. She was rebuilding her power base, establishing new connections to the physical world through other reflective surfaces. But Chris also noticed changes in the pattern of supernatural activity that suggested his actions had disrupted more than just Mary's individual power. Other investigators reported that entities throughout the region seemed weaker, less coordinated, as if some kind of supernatural network had been damaged. Chris theorized that Mary had been part of a larger system of predatory entities, and that destroying her primary stronghold had weakened the entire network. Most importantly, Chris found a measure of peace regarding Ben's death. His brother hadn't been weak or cowardly. He had been targeted by something that specialized in exploiting human vulnerability. Ben's sensitivity to supernatural phenomena hadn't been a symptom of mental illness, but an actual sensitivity to dimensions of reality that most people couldn't perceive. His death was still a tragedy, but it was a tragedy with a cause that could be understood and potentially prevented. Chris established the Benjamin Thompson Foundation for Paranormal Safety, dedicated to helping people who encountered supernatural phenomena they couldn't understand. The foundation provided resources for victims' families, funding for serious paranormal research, and emergency support for people experiencing supernatural harassment. Chris never again attempted to summon entities for research purposes, having learned that some knowledge came at too high a price. But he never forgot the most important lesson from his night in the Mirror House. Sometimes the only way to win a rigged game is to break the rules entirely, accepting destruction rather than domination, choosing chaos over the illusion of control. Mary had been ancient and powerful and patient, but she had also been predictable, trapped by her own nature, unable to imagine that someone might choose to destroy her carefully constructed trap rather than attempt to navigate it successfully. Years later, when Chris received reports of new mirror-related phenomena from investigators around the world, he would share his story not as a cautionary tale about following supernatural rules, but as evidence that even the most sophisticated predators could be defeated by people who understood that survival sometimes required accepting loss rather than pursuing victory. The story of 1847 Elm Street became legend among serious paranormal researchers, a case study in both the dangers of supernatural investigation and the possibility of emerging victorious from encounters with entities that had claimed dozens of previous victims. But for Chris, it remained deeply personal. The night he finally found his brother and lost his innocence. The moment he learned that love sometimes required destruction rather than preservation. Late at night, when Chris caught his reflection in his bathroom mirror, he sometimes saw Mary standing behind him, patient and beautiful and utterly malevolent, waiting for him to make another mistake. The black cloth he kept draped over every mirror in his home was a constant reminder that their war wasn't over, that she still existed somewhere in the spaces between reflections, planning her revenge with the patience of something that had eternity to work with. But Chris also saw something else in those brief glimpses. Ben's face free from the peace that Mary had imposed upon it, bearing the anxiety and uncertainty that had characterized his life, but also the fundamental humanity that supernatural transformation had tried to erase. His brother was gone, truly gone in ways that no amount of guilt or supernatural encounter could change. But Ben's death had meaning now, purpose beyond the simple tragedy of mental illness and suicide. The real victory hadn't been surviving the night in the mirror house or destroying Mary's primary gateway to the physical world. The real victory was understanding that some battles could only be won by people willing to lose everything rather than accept the terms offered by entities that viewed human consciousness as just another resource to be consumed. Chris kept a single shard of the gateway mirror on his desk, mounted in a frame that prevented any chance of reflection. It served as a reminder of the night he had faced something that had destroyed dozens of people stronger and more prepared than himself, and had emerged victorious, not through superior strength or knowledge, but through the simple human capacity for making choices that defied rational self-interest. The mirror fragment was cloudy, its reflective surface permanently damaged by the supernatural forces that had operated through it for over a century. But sometimes, in very specific lighting conditions, Chris could see shapes moving within the glass, shadows of the realm Mary had constructed, glimpses of the artificial peace she had offered to her victims, reminders of the price that consciousness paid when it accepted transformation rather than destruction. And sometimes, just sometimes, Chris thought he could see Ben's face in the fragment, not peaceful or transformed, but genuinely at rest, finally free from both the supernatural forces that had tormented him and the family expectations that had never quite understood his unique perspective on reality. It was the face of someone who had fought against impossible odds and lost, but whose loss had ultimately led to victory for others who might have faced similar fates. The Benjamin Thompson Foundation continued its work long after Chris's own death many decades later, a testament to the idea that individual tragedy could be transformed into collective protection through people willing to confront dangers that most preferred to ignore. The Foundation's motto, carved in stone above the entrance to its research facility, consisted of two simple words that summarized everything Chris had learned during his night in the mirror house: break everything. Because sometimes, when faced with systems designed to ensure your failure, regardless of how perfectly you followed their rules, the only path to victory was to destroy the game entirely and accept whatever consequences came from choosing chaos over the illusion of control. It was a lesson written in blood and glass, paid for with souls and sanity, but ultimately worth the price for those who understood that some forms of survival required the courage to lose everything rather than accept transformation into something that served purposes other than their own. The mirror fragment on Chris's desk remained cloudy and lifeless for the rest of his days, a piece of broken glass that had once served as a gateway between worlds, but now reflected nothing more dangerous than ordinary light. But the story it represented continued to echo through the paranormal research community, a reminder that even the most sophisticated predators could be defeated by people who understood that winning and surviving were sometimes two completely different things. And in houses across the world where mirrors hung in bathrooms and bedrooms and hallways, people continued to catch glimpses of movement that shouldn't exist, reflections that didn't quite match their physical forms, and beautiful women with sharp teeth who offered peace in exchange for truth. But now they had Chris's story as a guide, a map through territory that had previously claimed every explorer who dared to venture into the spaces between reflection and reality. The war between human consciousness and the entities that fed upon it continued, but the balance of power had shifted slightly in favour of those who understood that some games could only be won by people brave enough to break them entirely. It was a small victory in a conflict that spanned dimensions and centuries, but it was a victory nonetheless, and sometimes in the endless struggle between predator and prey, small victories were all that separated civilization from the darkness that waited in the spaces between mirrors. The story ended where it began, with reflections and consequences, truth and terror, and the simple human capacity for making choices that defied both supernatural manipulation and rational self-interest. Chris Thompson had gone looking for answers about his brother's death and had found something far more valuable, proof that even the most hopeless situations contain possibilities for resistance, rebellion, and ultimately a form of victory that transcended both survival and destruction. In the end, that was enough. It had to be enough. Because in the realm between mirrors, where ancient entities fed on human potential and consciousness became currency in games whose rules were designed to ensure mortal failure, the simple act of choosing destruction over domination was sometimes the most radical and effective form of resistance available to beings who valued their humanity more than their lives. The last reflection belonged to Ben, peaceful at last, not because he had been transformed into something beyond human limitation, but because his death had finally found meaning in his brother's survival and the protection it provided to others who might have faced similar fates. It was a reflection worth preserving, a memory worth the price that had been paid to secure it, and a reminder that love sometimes required breaking everything in order to save what mattered most. And in the spaces between mirrors, where Mary waited with patient malevolence for another chance to play her deadly games, the echo of shattering glass continued to reverberate, a sound that spoke of boundaries broken, rules defied, and the fundamental human capacity for choosing chaos over control, when control meant surrendering the very essence of what made consciousness worth preserving in the first place.